Good evening and welcome to episode 17 of the Isolation Podcast on Liverpool Student Radio. I'm joined again by Juliana Christensen and Charlie Millward. Good evening, both.
Hello.
Good evening, Chris.
I can see you both tonight, which is a different change. So we've upgraded our Skype so we can now see each other. So yeah, we've got a special episode for you tonight. We'll be hopefully joined on the line by Peter Hitchens. Charlie, are you able to add him to the call?
It could be calling now. We've been touchwood. We've been okay with the calling people into these chats. So,
hello.
Good evening. So,
good evening, Peter.
Good evening.
So,
I can't see myself. Am I light enough?
Yeah,
perfect.
You can do some artificial light if you need it.
No, that's okay. All good.
Brilliant.
So, as I just said to Juliana and Charlie Peter, thank you very much for joining us.
So far, it's a pleasure. We'll see how that carries on.
Hopefully, it'll still be a pleasure when we're done.
Yeah, I'm hoping that too.
For the purposes of the listeners, we're joined on the call by author and senior journalist at the Mail on Sunday, Peter Hitchens. Good evening, Peter. Peter, first of all, much has been made largely from your appearance on Good Morning Britain earlier in the week of your view on the current lockdown in the UK. Is your issue with it purely premised in economic concerns, or is it more to do with an issue of civil liberty?
Oh, it's both, but it's also an issue of life and the pursuit of happiness, as it might be, and a danger to life and health, which comes from what's being done. But most fundamentally, it's an issue of proportion. It's a question of whether the government's actions have any real relation to the size of the problem which they claim to deal with. And I think that's disputable, and I dispute it. And I think that the other thing people must understand is that to be concerned about the economy is not to be some kind of glinting, efficient person who doesn't care about human life or health or any of those things, because it is within the economy that we live and move and have our being. To say that you don't care about the economy, but you care about your house would be ridiculous, because you'd then be saying you didn't care about the roof or the foundations or the walls, and that's what it provides. If we don't have the thriving economy, which creates the tax base, for instance, for the National Health Service, which everyone claims to be so in love with, then there will be no National Health Service as we know it. And people who visit poor countries with low tax bases can easily see what the public services are like there. I've experienced this when I lived in the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. You just didn't go near, if you could possibly help it, the public hospitals. They were ill-equipped, the buildings were decrepit, they didn't have anesthetics, they didn't have good post-operative care, not because the Soviet government didn't want them to have those things, but because they simply couldn't afford it. They had ambitions to provide a comprehensive health service, but they couldn't do it. And the problem with a country which goes bust is that it's in that sort of position. And so all these wonderful new buildings and all the rest of it cannot be sustained, cannot be maintained at the levels which make them effective unless we have a thriving economy. If you then crash the economy, you are threatening life. The other thing, and I've stressed this again and again, because it's been said by a brilliant man, a German professor called Professor Dr. Suchrit Bachedi of the University of Mainz in Germany. He's repeatedly said that the danger of shutting people in their homes is particularly great to the healthy old, who rely enormously on the social contact of the busy social and cultural lives which they lead, of which they're now being deprived. And many of them will permanently face health damage from this. If the government then goes further and imposes this sort of mad collective punishment of banning us from going outside at all, as Matt Hancock seemed to be suggesting last Sunday, then people will undoubtedly die. The healthy old will undoubtedly die in large numbers from being deprived of the exercise which has hitherto kept them healthy. So this isn't a question of life versus money, or a question of life versus liberty. It's a question of life and liberty being threatened, and the economy, which is the basis of our happy and healthy lives, being threatened as well. And it fundamentally is the action being taken by the government in proportion to the threat which it claims that we face, or indeed the threat which we actually face, which may not be the same thing. And are we examining, interrogating the figures we're being given properly, so as to see that what we're being told is actually true?
Yes, you lay out them arguments there. So why do you think that your argument seems to be such, one that's not really supported by many people, considering, that you give these points out? Why do you think this is?
Well, I've never believed that a majority decides whether an answer is right or wrong. And I know from long experience that there are many things where at the start of them, if you oppose them, then you're on your own and people swear at you and insult you and pelt you with slime. And 5 years later, everybody claims they agree with you at the time because they've come around to what you thought. What I'm saying now is what most people will be saying in 5 years' time. But I wish they would say it now, because the crashing of the economy is so disastrous for everybody that if people don't oppose it now, every day that it goes on makes the consequences worse. And of course, in any economy, the people who suffer most from its weakness and failure are the poor, and the weak, and the old, and the young, and generally those who cannot look after themselves. And so anybody who claims to be concerned about his fellow creature should really be much more worried than they are. And the trouble is that the people don't understand the nature of where taxation comes from, what happens if a government borrows more than it can conceivably afford to pay back or service, what happens if the currency is inflated. They've never seen it in their lives. They've never seen catastrophe. Again, I have seen catastrophe. And I'll tell you the problem about catastrophe, because I saw it again in Moscow, when the Moscow middle class were pretty much ruined at a stroke by currency reforms and various other things which happened to them. The problem with catastrophe is that you survive it. You continue to live, but you've lost the job that you had, you've lost the security you had, your children can't go to the schools or universities they thought they could go to, you no longer have any money, your savings have been abolished at a stroke. I saw middle-class people selling their possessions on the street to pay for bread. And these are people who 6 months before would have said, oh, don't be ridiculous, this is unimaginable, but it happened. And the problem was that they were still alive. Had they been in an earthquake or a meteorite strike, everything would have gone. But the problem was the lives they led had gone. They were still alive, living their lives as ghosts of their former selves in circumstances which they found unimaginable. People should understand that we're talking here about economic crisis on the level of the 1930s if we're not careful. And there's a particular story I remember reading in the New York Times, reminiscence of the 1930s by an American journalist, saying that he recalled people who had been university professors coming to the kitchen door of his parents' house and begging for work or money. People who had been university professors begging for money or work. That's what happens if economies really go down the plumbing. The longer we carry on with this, the more likely it is our economy will go right down the plumbing. So it's not irresponsible, it seems to me, to raise this danger, especially when it's not popular to raise it. In fact, it's my absolute duty as a citizen of a free country, if I am concerned, which I am, to say so. If I'm wrong, then let other people come out and argue with me. But what I found disturbing is that generally my arguments are greeted with silence. I have not once been accorded a minute on the BBC, the national broadcaster. They know who I am. I'm not exactly obscure, but they won't have me on. And you mentioned the Piers Morgan programme. Well, Piers and I have many disagreements, but you have to give him this. He had me on the programme. He allowed me a chance to make my case. And the same has been true, actually, of the talk radio. But no BBC television programme, no BBC radio programme has given me the same thing. And this is shocking to me. And I know from my correspondence, which of course is selective and would have confirmation bias in it, but I know from this that there are many, many people who do agree with me and believe that this matter should be raised. My view is that Parliament should have been the place where it was raised, but Parliament completely failed to debate it when it first came out. And it passed a very, very dangerous law without even a vote. And then much of the media, who are again supposed to be the great safeguard of this country's liberty, just sat and agreed with what the government told them. That's not their job. The ABC, the reporters ABC, is assume nothing, believe nobody, check everything. Well, on this occasion, the media assumed everything was true. They believe what they were told and they check nothing, and they're still doing it for the most part. And it's been shocking. It's as if you bought a car with two sets of brakes, and both of them failed completely.
So we look at Sweden as well as another country, well, probably the only country that stands by itself now as not going into lockdown.
There are others, but it's the most prominent.
Most prominent, yeah. What can we take from this approach that they've done? You know, what have they done that we could or should have taken in the first place? Well,
it's to some extent, it's much more what they haven't done. My colleague Ian Gallagher, who is the chief reporter of the Mail on Sunday, spent some time talking to the head of the Swedish body which monitors this. And he said, well, he had been quite pleased with the original British response and was shocked when they suddenly went into this decision to start shutting down the economy. What Sweden has done is proportionate. It's closed some schools. It's restricted the size of gatherings to, I think, 50 now. If you go to a cafe, there's no bar service. You have to sit at a table and be waited on. People are expected to take reasonable measures that a responsible human being can take to distance themselves from each other. But they have not closed down Stockholm and turned it into a ghost city or anywhere else. And the place continues to function as an economy. They understand they have lost by what they have done quite substantially, and that there will be a fall in gross domestic product. But they haven't gone as far as we have. It's been a proportionate response. And I have to tell you, looking at the figures, that there is no connection that I can see mathematically at all between the action which the British government has taken and the number of cases of COVID-19 deaths which are recorded, and no connection between the action the Swedish government has taken. The figures appear to vary completely independently of this. And this is the fascinating thing. If you look at all the countries where there have been outbreaks of COVID-19, starting with China, moving on to South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, United States, Latin America, the Netherlands, France, Italy, Spain, wherever it is, you cannot find a pattern which shows that this particular action has been successful. The one which people seem to think has been successful is the one in Wuhan in China, where the Chinese government, which instinctively resorts to repression because that's what it does, resorted to repression. But we don't know whether the Chinese government's claim to have got it under control is even true. Because in a police state, a censored police state such as the People's Republic of China, you cannot conceivably rely on statistics as being a proper representation of the truth. We don't know. Fascinating thing as well. Hong Kong and Singapore were both praised, two very similar city-states on small patches of land, were both praised for their response to the crisis. And they, oddly enough, the results of their responses were pretty much the same. But the interesting thing is, if you look at their responses, they were different. So different actions led to the same response. There is no pattern. There is nobody who can stand up and say, either using correlation or let alone causation, that there is any connection between the action being taken by the British government and any reduction in deaths. And that's leaving aside any examination of the figures for deaths which the government produced, which badly need to be examined.
Peter, do you think there'll become a point where a larger number of people will come around to your way of thinking, or do you think we will go through this period of lockdown to a point at which, the medical evidence that we're being constantly quoted will have fallen to a level that they sort of think that it would be appropriate to relax social distancing measures?
I hugely wish that a prominent supporter of the government's policy would change his or her mind and come out and say so, because the problem with my taking up any case is that so many people hate me, that the chances are that the fact that I've taken up the case will prevent it from becoming generally accepted. This is a thing I have to deal with. I call it the curse of Cassandra: always to be right, never to be believed. I think in 4 or 5 years' time, a very large number of people will agree with me. And we have the other problem, which I will describe to you in the form of a metaphor. A patient develops very bad chickenpox, and it's extremely painful and a grave discomfort to him. So he goes to see his doctor, and his doctor says, well, this is very serious chickenpox, and there's this new treatment from China for chickenpox, which I propose to use on you. And the patient says, well, what is that? And the doctor says, well, I'll cut off your right leg. Chickenpox will go away. So the patient says, or you must obviously know what you're doing, so I'll accept this. The doctor cuts the patient's leg off. Patient recovers from chickenpox, as he would have done anyway. The doctor then preens himself and says, what a fantastic job he did, that he cured the man's chickenpox, and then presents him with an enormous bill. That is the metaphor for what's going on here. The government is saying that its policy, which is deeply damaging, will succeed in curing the problem. If the problem goes away anyway, the government will then say that what it did succeeded, and many people will believe it. And this is something we have to be prepared for. It's very difficult to establish the truth when government closes ranks on itself. So this day, for instance, nobody has really acknowledged the immense dishonesty of the government's involvement in the Iraq War. And the people who were involved have not really suffered politically as a result of what they did. And the great test for me has always been that the brilliant and courageous Elizabeth Wilmshurst, the one senior civil servant who refused to accept the case for war and actually resigned, has to this day, although she already had an honour because she was such a superb civil servant, to this day not been honoured for her courage. And until that happened, you can say this mistake has not been acknowledged. I'm determined, if I possibly can, to ensure that this mistake will be acknowledged, because if we don't understand that we are making a mistake here, then it will undoubtedly happen again.
And so we see the example of the countries like Sweden and then South Korea. Obviously, there's a range of different techniques that countries are taking. If our own country, is to be so flawed, is there a kind of a middle ground that you think could have been reached between what happened in the UK and the, stance that other countries have taken and how they proceeded?
I think Sweden is pretty much following a middle ground. Sweden is not run by maniacs. They have, there have been big arguments, and there are still many people in Sweden who feel they haven't gone far enough in closing down the country. But so far, those people have been defeated in argument, and they haven't won. I live constantly in dread that they will. And then the last example of a country reacting normally and rationally to this will have gone. The Netherlands is also being, how shall I put it, a good deal more cautious. And Japan, although it's cleverly appearing to be terribly tough, by creating a supposed state of emergency. Actually, the state of emergency is almost entirely toothless and is designed, I think, to fend off both international and internal calls for tougher action in a country which has, thank heaven, to this day suffered very few COVID-19 deaths. So there are other holdouts, but it seems to me to be beyond doubt is that the measures taken by Rishi Sunak are draining this economy of wealth and cutting off the blood supply to large parts of the economy, every sector. This is so much now a service economy. Every sector, from tourism to retail, is dying visibly on its feet. The whole lifeblood of the economy is ceasing to flow. And I've lived in my hometown of Oxford for more than 50 years, and I know the businesses and restaurants and shops that have existed here for a long time, and I see them all closed, or those that are allowed to remain open struggling to try and work out how on earth they're going to pay their next month's rent. And these are real problems for real people, human beings who, by living on their wits and working hard, many, many long hours a day, have managed to make a living and now are being prevented from doing so by their own government. It's an astonishing thing to see.
And so I also read your book not long ago, The Abolition of Britain, and I think we will link this in the bio to this podcast. And I think the one recurring theme of the book is Britain is on the downhill, really. Does what is happening here?
It's a controversial thing to say, is it?
So does this exacerbate what you were saying? Pretty much, it proves you right again.
Well, the thing that I identified particularly in that book, which is now 20 years old, was the growing amount of conformism in thought, in which I think had a lot to do with the huge increased power of electronic media. Now, at the time I wrote the book, this was basically colour television, which had become a very strong conformist force in making people think that everybody laughed at the same jokes, wore the same sort of clothes, looked more or less the same because of the conformism it promoted. But what I hadn't realized was just how much more conformist society would come when social media, which were then barely a twinkle in anybody's eye, became as important as they subsequently did. But it's a very conformist society. And the other thing is that we have embraced, and I make this point in the book as well, not as strongly as I now wish I had, perhaps, we've embraced egalitarianism as the thing which we most believe in. And egalitarianism is very hostile to the development and maintenance of intellectual elites of the kind which you really badly need in crises of this kind, where people are prepared to stand up and say, actually, no, this is wrong. You have instead clients of the state who are not anything like as courageous and independent as a freestanding middle class. All the institutions, pretty much, educational institutions, are now pretty much clients of the state themselves and exist more in its gaze and under its sunny smile and fear it. And the whole existence of an independent middle class, professionals who were self-employed or definitely economically and politically independent of government and able to stand up for themselves, has been undermined. And the abolition of selective secondary education has dealt a terrible blow to the intellectual quality of the whole country, because it's not, people will say, well, we have the private schools, and we do have the private schools, but actually their standards also fell very gravely when selective secondary education was abolished. They no longer had anybody to compete against, and they were able, by the nature of their enormous riches and their small classes, to do well at examinations without necessarily teaching anybody much. And what we don't have is a very large number of people who know how to think. We've got an awful lot of people who've been taught what to think. But they're absolutely no use in a crisis. What you need in a crisis is people who know how to do it, and there's the difficulty. And I speak almost from beyond the grave. I'm so old, but I was educated in a different era, and that's one of the reasons why I do what I do and say what I say.
And lastly on that, so you obviously were talking about schooling, really. So what we've seen with this lockdown is there's going to be no A-level examinations in the summer. So do you think this is also a diminishment of academic standards?
Well, I don't think it'll help standards which are already low. But I feel very, very badly for the many people whose lives, whose university applications, whose careers are going to be blighted by this summer in which examinations can't take place. And obviously, people at university are in similar problems. First of all, they had the teachers' strike, and now they have this, and their courses are completely disrupted. I think many are going to have to take this year again if they're going to get proper degrees or benefit fully from the courses for which they have already contracted appalling loans. And really heavy financial burdens, both for tuition and for accommodation. And they're going to have to find another year, I think, if they're going to do what they really need to do. And I feel very badly for them, because this is, in my view, wholly unnecessary and should not have happened. And it's one of the many prices. But I think the number of ludicrous things that are going on. You can't go to the dentist. What happens to somebody who has a terrible screaming toothache? There are no dentists. If you're suffering from any medical complaint apart from COVID at the moment, the National Health Service doesn't really want to hear from you. So all kinds of people do suffer from other things, or worried that they may have the initial symptoms of a cancer they want to have checked. They'll find that under these circumstances, it's difficult for them to do so. This is why I talk all the time about proportion. There are other things going on, from the running of the economy to the running of the education system, to human liberty, to the exercise that people need to take, to the social contacts which people, especially older people, need to stay happy and contented and mentally well. And all these things are being chucked aside for one single problem, which I think has been severely overestimated in importance.
Peter, go, Juliana, go on.
Sorry. And under the current situation, then, do you think it would be right for the government to try alleviate some measures and have the kind of academic year, finished under some normalcy? Or do you think it's better in the situation to just kind of call it a day with the year to start with and kind of start fresh in say September?
I'd have to ask students who'd gone through this for their opinions on that.
You've got three here, Peter.
Yeah.
So I'd have to know what you felt. I feel that for so many, this year was first of all so badly blighted by the lecturers' strike, and then was blighted by this, that I think anybody at university has been cheated this year. But that's my opinion looking at it. You may feel differently. You may want to get on with it. The difficulty is who pays for the missing year. If it's you, then that's really tough. But on the other hand, where's the money going to come from if anybody else is going to pay for it? So this is one of these problems that nobody thought about when they said, okay, well, let's shut down the universities, let's shut down the transport system, let's shut down the schools, let's shut down this, that, and the other because of this. And again, I say, let's interrogate for a moment, because this is vitally important. Let's interrogate what is actually going on. Now, I ceaselessly quote, because it's so fascinating, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jenny Harris, speaking at the government press conference on Sunday afternoon. And I put it on Twitter. I haven't got the exact quote in front of me, and I won't annoy you by digging for it. But she said that a lot of the deaths being announced were deaths of people who died with COVID. And I'm abbreviating and simplifying this, but this is the fundamental point, rather than people who died of it. So quite a lot of the deaths are being recorded of people who died, and COVID was involved, but it wasn't perhaps the real reason for it. If you look carefully at what figures we have, you'll also find that the level of actual excess deaths, although there are slightly more per day than usual, there's no question about that, it's not enormous. The general level of deaths, people die in this country at a rate, and every one of these deaths is no doubt a tragedy, and each man's death diminishes me, and I'm sure you agree with that. But it is so that in the nature of life and death, we all have a fatal disease called life. We all die, and 1,600 of us depart this life every day. And so if that goes up on occasion to perhaps 1,750, you are not dealing with a gigantic cataclysm. You may be dealing with a serious disease which has brought grief and loss into the lives of many. But is that a justification for the measures being taken? And you have to consider that. And these figures are simply not being interrogated. And then there are all kinds of other claims being made. The government comes out with figures of infections. Well, these mean nothing. We don't actually know who's been infected with COVID-19. All three of you and I could have been infected with it and not know. It's perfectly possible to have it without any symptoms at all. And the healthier you are and the younger you are, and indeed the more female you are, because men are more vulnerable to it than women for some reason, the more likely it is that you could have had it without knowing. The other fascinating thing is that you can continue to be infectious for an extraordinarily long time after you've had it. So the number of people already circulating in society who quite possibly have it and are infecting other people without having any idea they're doing so is probably very considerable. There's an alternative study from Oxford University, who are the rivals to Imperial College in epidemiology, which suggests precisely this has happened, that a very large proportion of the population have quite possibly already had it. And yet this isn't examined by the government, and when it was published in the Financial Times, it was widely dismissed because it wasn't convenient. They'd already made up their minds. And here's a simple point about government policy, and this is absolutely true. I spent a long time covering government policy. The bigger the mistake, the harder it is to admit it, and therefore the less likely it is anybody will say, we've got it wrong, we need to change the policy. So I'm inclined, for the sake of the country, to let these idiots off their mistake and say, well, if what you want to do is to get out of this without being blamed for your idiocy, then okay, I'd be perfectly happy not to draw too much attention to it. If slice by slice, area by area, you let up. So say on Monday they said, right, we're allowing garden centres to open as well as supermarkets, and covered markets to open as well as supermarkets. And on Wednesday you said, actually, it would be a very good idea if people weren't banned from going to the dentist anymore. So we're going to open up the dentists, and then bit by bit to relax it to the point where, although it still formally exists, it's actually ceased, and we've got back to something like normal, or at least something like Sweden. And if during that time the effects are seen not to be disastrous, then it would seem to me to confirm that would be the right thing to do. And I very much hope that there are sensible enough people in the government and the civil service who are capable of taking that sort of decision.
Peter,
Go on, Charlie. No, go on, Charlie.
No, you go, Chris. Before the end.
Peter, just lastly from me, I just wanted to ask you if you thought there was an element of hypocrisy at government level in regards to the advice that they're giving to the wider population and then their own following of that advice. Obviously, Matt Hancock didn't seem to spend 7 full days or 14 days in isolation before he took back to the government briefings. Do you think there's sort of an element of, oh, well, we'll sort of advise the population one thing and we'll do another?
Well, I suppose there always is, but honestly, I think probably it's impossible to live any kind of life without occasionally breaching these guidelines to some extent. But I think again, this refers back to the Oxford study and the possibility that this has been circulating for longer than we think and is more widespread than we think. Even if they had been, everybody in Downing Street, and a lot of government in this country is conducted from pretty rickety, cramped buildings anyway. Even if they had been absolutely rigorously abiding by their own policy, it's perfectly possible that several of them were incubating the disease before they ever put the lockdown in place. I don't think I want to engage in that kind of thing, because I'm about politics. If people attack me personally enough and show themselves to, I have this rule, I call it the presumption of intelligence. As long as people argue intelligently with me, then I will argue reasonably with them back. If people absolutely insist on wanting a fight, then I'll go ad hominem with the best of them, and I'll do it better than they will. But in general, I prefer not to, because particularly in this case, because so much is at stake. Whichever way you look at it, lives, health, and happiness are at stake. And in my view, the economic future and security of the country are at stake as well. So I try very hard not to personalize it, because it just seems to me to make it harder to make the point.
Peter, thank you very much for coming on today and giving up your time. Really thank you for it, and yeah, thank you very much.
No, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it, and it was a good conversation. I'm grateful to you for asking me. If you